Welcome to the Balance Blueprints podcast, where we discuss the optimal techniques for finances and health, and then break it down to create an individualized and balanced plan. I'm your host, Justin Gaines, here with my co-host, John Prober. In this episode, John and I are going to not talk about the numbers, talk more about the habits and the behaviors that allow for your budget to actually work for you and allow you to find a path to financial freedom. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy. So I just started this new book. Just started listening to it a couple weeks ago. Hopefully this doesn't screw up our recording because I'm going to switch over here to Audible to see the title of it. And it was one of these things that, because I listen to and read so many books, I was at that point where everything on my wish list, my upcoming read list, watch list, listen list, whatever it is on Audible. All those books, they just weren't speaking to me. And so I was like, I had 2 credits that I needed to use. And then this recommendation came up. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me give it a listen. And I'm so glad I did. I'm going to incorporate this book when I work with clients because it completely foregoes the charts and the numbers and all that stuff and just gets down to the basic concepts, behaviors, habits, and education around the topic. It's very easy to jump into the numbers and say, oh, this is the percentage and the ratios, but this just explains the background behind where most people get their financial education, which is their parents and the people that they're around consistently, and then how that domino affects into people's financial budgets and long-term habits. So the name of the book is The Algebra of Wealth, A Simple Formula for Financial Security by Scott Galloway. Like I said, it foregoes the numbers. And it's interesting because he'll even say, if you're well-versed in financials, you can skip this chapter. You don't have to listen to this or you don't have to read this. And I still listen to it just because I think listening to the basics. And I think I get this from the sports background where every sport, no matter what level of sports you play at, there's practice sessions that you have that are specifically on the basics because you're going to catch something you're doing wrong or you'll notice little tweaks that you need to make or something will just look different for you. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely applied in this chapter, which got to the topic of budgeting, where I've had clients say, we sit down, we do the budget, and then they're like, oh, this budget isn't working for me. And it always blows my mind because I'm like, well, we sat down and we wrote everything out and you told me what your expenses were. You told me what your income was. So what number's wrong is what my mind always goes to. Is what expense did we leave out? Okay, let's grab your banking statements. Let's do an audit. Let's see what you're spending money on that you didn't disclose or that you just, and it's not even, I don't want to say it in the sense of you didn't disclose it. It's just the nature of there's clearly some extra expenses that you're not seeing or that you're not used to seeing because it's $10 at Starbucks every other week or twice a week instead of once a week. And you said, if it was every other week, you said you don't do it at all, or you said you do it once a week and it's really twice a week, every other week or every week. And so those little incremental adjustments cause issues down the line long term. And some of that has to do with the timing of the calendar that we follow because most people are paid every 2 weeks. But even if you're paid every week payments have less of this issue. But if you're paid every 2 weeks, some months you have 2 payments a month, and some months you have 3 payments in a month. And so the timing of your rent or mortgage payments typically will offset and mess up your cash flow if you're not following this really closely. So you need to know what payment cycle is the rent coming in at and which payment cycle are the payments coming in at to line those up. Because for a lot of people, that rent payment is going to take up a good portion of one of your paychecks. And so if you're only having 2 payments in a month, you're living off of one, and then you're covering your housing expense off of the other. But what a lot of clients do, and I didn't even realize until I was listening to this book, but we sit down, we do a budget. We make a budget. But that's only half of the equation. Because that's just the theory, that's just the concept. Is that, okay, this is the amount of income, this is the amount of expenses. If you don't ever actually go back and track your expenses in each one of those categories, you're most likely going to be off in one of those categories because of those extra expenses. Or maybe you thought, I fill up my gas tank once a week at $40 a tank, so I need $160. And it's not really every week, so let's round that down. We'll say $150 a month for gas. And then you take extra road trips that week or that month. You go on a long 1-day trip or 2-day trip with some friends, and you decide that you're going to be the one that drives, and you do that once a month or twice a month, and you don't think about it. But now you had an extra fill up of your gas tank. So now your 160 actually was 200, but because you weren't tracking it, you still stayed at 150. And then for the next month, you still stayed at 150, and you never readjusted for that extra $40, $50 of expense. And so the actual habit of, okay, this is a budget, but each month or each pay cycle, we also need to go in and mark down, what did we actually spend? What did we do here? What did we do there? And as I'm reading the book, there are little habits that I'm doing that I wasn't doing before, wasn't as religious about, that now achieving those goals becomes a lot easier because you're seeing where your deficiencies are and where you're overspending, where you're underspending, and then you can reallocate that budget. But a lot of times people aren't doing the work after they create the budget. Created the budget, we're all set. Now we don't track the expenses. But tracking the expenses is almost more important than the actual budgeting piece itself.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this before with when we were going over, what is it, net zero or?
Yeah, net zero budgeting.
Yeah, and I mentioned before that that's usually how I did it, but I kind of like the credit card method where I want to switch to that because I feel like that's more on the topic of this. Because like I said before, one-time things would come up that you wouldn't account for in your budget when you make it. And they're hard to account for them because they're different. It's not like, even like the example you used, if you take consistent road trips but don't think about them because they're just these events coming up. But like for me, it was like a one-time thing here and then a one-time thing in a completely different area. So it's hard to even account for that because there's literally no routine.
And I think you should do both together. So I think you should have a net zero budget and then use the credit card method to borrow from different categories, but make it so that, and even for my budget, like I have my debt obligations and like fixed payments, your everything that has to come out of your bank account that you can't pay with a credit card, your life insurance, your mortgage, your other insurances, any other loans that you have, your credit card payments. But then I make the credit card, which covers all of those other expenses, one large item. And then I actually create a sub budget for the credit card. So the credit card I'm allowed to spend, we'll say $2,000 a month on, and then I break out what that $2,000 a month goes to. So then I can track it in each category. But like you said, now you can borrow from each category as long as the total stays below the 2,000, because you can borrow from each category and say, okay, I spent less in gas this month, so now I can go buy, splurge on some clothing or on a night out or take an extra night out for date night or go to a little bit nicer restaurant because we didn't spend in these other categories towards the end of the month. And I think it allows for the ease of recording. But again, you've got to make sure that, okay, I said 3,000, but or 2,000, am I actually hitting that 2,000 number? Or am I going over and hitting 3,000 and then causing an issue in that budget, or 2,100? $1,000 difference is going to be significant in your budget, but building that habit of actually going in and tracking, that's when you'll start to see where you're overspending or where you don't think you eat out that much. And then you realize, oh, I don't eat out at sit down restaurants that much, but I do stop on my way home and grab fast food because I don't want to have to cook that night. So it's only $10, it's only $15. Let me just stop, grab it, and then not have to cook that night. But that offsets your entire budget throughout the week or throughout the month.
So are those, from what you've read so far, or if you finished it, are those mainly the tips and tricks, is just being a lot more diligent?
There's a lot in the book. That's one of the big ones that stuck out to me. The other big one was, and we've talked about this before as well, where the habits associated with maintaining your finances are a muscle, and you have to build that muscle. So one of his recommendations, which if you have the room in the budget, I do think it's a good thing, is he believes that if you're trying to build a savings, which most of us are, even if you just take $10 a month, or $5 a paycheck, and put that into a savings account, yes, it's not going to build quickly, but what it's doing is it's creating the habit that a portion of your paycheck goes to saving every single month.
Mm-hmm.
And so even for me, I'm in a period of my financial journey right now where I think in the next, 2 to 3 years, the economy is going to pull back. A lot of things are going to come up for sale. There's going to be opportunities to acquire assets at a reasonable price and move into those. So I'm trying to deleverage myself, reduce my debts in order to be able to take on more debts in the next 2 to 3 years. So I haven't been putting as much money towards savings. But after I read this, I was like, no, that's a really good point. Continue to have that income stream open, or that savings stream open. Just set it at $10 a month. And then as you adjust your budget, you're just going to move more money into that savings category as you eliminate some of these expenses. Or move it. And I do the same thing with my investment accounts. Like I have the investment account. There's an income stream that goes into the stock market investment account. And with that, as you have more money, you can put more money into that category. But having that income stream open, or that savings stream open, allows you to have the muscle build of being used to doing it. And then it allows for that pathway, instead of having to go in and like, oh, now I got to figure out a savings account and I have to figure out how to automate this or how to set it up. And there's all the hurdles that you have to go through. If you have that stream open, it's just a matter of adjusting it, and you're already used to doing it. So it builds that habit much faster. He's a big proponent too of using apps like Acorn that round up every transaction you have and then put that change into savings. Mm-hmm. Because again, his argument is that that's not going to save your entire financial outlook, but it is going to build that habit. It's going to allow certain things to just start to be put away. And then eventually over time, you will have something that's amassed into a sizable either investment or savings or whatever the case may be, but it's about building those habits. So there's a lot of the topics that are discussed are topics that we've discussed, but it might be taking it from a different perspective, and it makes it very simple, very cohesive, and it's just education focused. There's no numbers. It doesn't drag you into that. And it also just justifies or explains what causes the lack of financial education in the world, really. And he even brings up that high schools, colleges, unless you go into a business track in college, the amount of financial education we have in our financial program or in our educational programs is very minimal. And so the vast majority of individuals learn their financial habits from their parents. And he argues that the reason why the rich get richer has some to do with economics, but has more to do with the education that they receive from their parents. If you have wealthy parents, you get a wealthy mindset around money. Mm-hmm. And when you have less affluent parents, you get a less affluent mindset around money. And so it starts to compound. Those habits continue to build off each other, because if you're come from a less affluent family and you're used to overspending on stuff, or you don't have the budget, then when you have a little bit of money, you can go and splurge and use that extra money to have some enjoyment, short-term, immediate enjoyment, because you weren't able to have it for the past year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. And so what this is saying is that, that's not what you should do. Okay, take 40% of it and go do something fun. Take 60% of it and put it towards savings, put it towards, building towards that retirement years. Yeah. And just breaking down those different elements that are tricky to navigate and tough to hear. But I think one of the biggest things that I always hear with my clients that are less affluent or come from a less affluent upbringing is that the goal is to get to never thinking about money. And that is just so wrong and so not true. I even used to be in that mindset of like, let me just amass the amount of money, the most amount of money I can. And then that way I won't have to ever think about money. And the more and more I learn about finances, the more and more I realize that if you want to get into a secure position with finances, you need to have a healthy obsession with money. You need to have a system to track it. You need an outline of, a roadmap, which is your budget, a system to track it and make sure that you're on course, which is what we talked about today, of tracking those expenses, keeping on top of those things. And then you need the accountability piece, that if you're falling behind, it's not, okay, I'll just do better next month. It's, no, I'm going to readjust next month, replenish what I overspent by, reduce my budget next month by those numbers, and then get back on course as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. You'll never get to a point where you don't think about money. The only outcome from not thinking about money is being broke.
Spending it all.
Yeah. You spend it all. It's just, if you don't give your money a job, it will magically disappear on its own.
Find a job for someone else. It's the other thing I like too is it's just one of those things of, like, even if you look at small health habits, you think you're too big for them, or you think you're above them. And it's not about that. Like you said, it's just so good to keep that muscle going. Like even for you, the difference of, sure, when you pick up your savings again, if you completely stopped it, it might not be that hard for you versus someone else. But like you said, $10, 10 cents, it just keeps that muscle alive versus it completely withering away. So
right. Yeah.
It's hard to remember that.
Keeping that flow of consciousness of, I need to do this. This is something I need to be doing. Okay, let's continue to put it there. And if you put it into a high yield savings, like we suggest, and like what I do, you keep in front of inflation. Because if you just have it in a checking account and it's making 0.25%, and inflation's at 2.5-3%, you've lost 2.75% of that money. Yeah. Whereas, and this is part of what the book does too, is like it gives you the education on these topics, that if you're in the high yield savings, like both of us are, you have a 5% rate of return, but your real rate of return after inflation is really 2% if inflation's at 3%. So you're really only making 2% on your money above and beyond inflation, which is why you call it the real rate of return, because your purchasing power, if you keep pace with inflation, is the same.
Yeah. You
can buy the same amount of stuff. If you don't keep pace with inflation, your money isn't able to buy the same amount of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So it gets into that piece. And then part of the reason why you want that savings stream open is there's two ways that you can go about trying to amass wealth: higher rates of return or larger amount of money making that rate of return. Because if you take $1,000 and you make 50% on that, you've made $500.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take $100,000 and you make 5% on that, you've made $500.
Yeah.
5% is much more obtainable than 50% consistently year over year. And we're doing it in a high yield savings right now because of the interest markets that we're in. But the difference in how much money you're getting out of it is the amount of capital that you have in there. And so slowly putting away more money and building that capital up is why you're able to then generate a larger sum of money off of it with taking on less risk.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a good reminder of the basics, but a great book for beginners as well.
Yeah, I think personally, there's a financial advisor that I work very closely with, and I've told him the same thing. I was like, you should buy 15 to 20 of these books, have them in your office, and the people who are very interested in learning about it and actually getting themselves to a stronger financial position should read this book.
Yeah.
Especially if they, if you're building a budget with this client, or if you're listening to this podcast and building a budget, I would 10 out of 10 recommend reading this book, grabbing a copy of it, and just digging into it. It's, probably going to be, it's probably going to be $15, $20 book, but it's going to be the best $15 to $20 you've ever spent to start your financial education journey, because it breaks down the basics. It gives you a fundamental understanding of how markets work, how budgeting works, how money works. And then from there, you're going to be able to position into more in-depth financial planning But I have always said and will continue to say that your financial plan should be very basic. You should be able to explain your financial plan to an 8-year-old, and they should be able to understand it. If you're getting into a complex financial plan, it should be because you already have a solid foundation that you're building off of. And you should still be able to explain your complex plan to an 8-year-old in a way that they understand it. And it's because you have the mastery of that financial plan. And so you're able to distill that into something that an 8-year-old can understand. Mm-hmm. You cannot explain your financial plan to an 8-year-old. It is too complex and you're probably being taken advantage of.
Fair. Thanks for listening to our podcast.
We hope this helps you on your balance freedom journey.
Please share your thoughts in the comments section below.
Until next time, stay balanced.